Services. I work advocates for Greater Boston Legal Services. We will be reading testimony on behalf of our clients. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to testify. My name is Lisa Bradley, and I will read the testimony of Ivory Hester. My name is Ivory Hester. I have a 4-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old son. My children and I used to live in an apartment with my father until I learned that he was abusing them. I turned him into the police and he went to jail. Without his financial assistance, I couldn't afford the apartment anymore. We moved in with my parents. However, on September 17th, they told me I could no longer stay with them. They were so stressed. They weren't even sure if they could afford to stay there. Also, my father was verbally abusive to me and threatened to call the police if I stayed one more night. That evening, I stayed with my brother, his girlfriend, and their 2 children. But they live in subsidized housing and aren't allowed to have others living with them. Plus, there isn't enough room in their tiny apartment. The next day, having nowhere to sleep, I applied for shelter at DHCD in Dudley. I was told that because there was running water at my brother's home, and because it wasn't a safety risk, I was being denied shelter. I asked the worker to please reconsider the denial because we couldn't go back there and didn't have anywhere to live. All she said was that I could appeal or come back again to reapply. I did appeal, but that didn't help me find a place to sleep that night. I had a list of shelters and called all of them, but there weren't any openings. They all had long waiting lists. For the next 2 nights, I convinced friends to let us sleep in their apartments. My children and I stayed with 2 different friends, neither could keep us more than 1 night because they didn't have room and they weren't allowed to have other people living there. After staying with these 2 friends, I ran out of options. We had to sleep in my mother's car. I drove to a park near Gurney Hospital. I was familiar with that area of the park and thought it was the safest place to spend the night. My children shared the back seat. They were crying, confused, and upset. They were scared because it was so dark. I tried comforting them, and I too was scared. I slept off and on, maybe a half hour at a time. Besides getting nightmares from having to sit in the front seat for so long, I was constantly afraid someone would break the windows and hurt us. I called everyone I knew during those 2 days. I finally talked to legal services, who explained I was actually eligible and I should reapply for shelter. Nobody told me at DHCD if we had stayed at different places or even in our car that we would be eligible. I needed to reapply. I brought all the proof they needed, and a DCF assessor came to my mother's home. We are fortunate and thankful that we do now have shelter. However, I am here to ask that DHCD please change their new regulations to prevent families like mine from having to sleep in cars or parks or bounce from one house to another. No child or family should ever